One day in 2011, in Northumberland, the hometown of British police officer Vera, a tragic death occurred. The victim was Jeanie, in her 30s. She was a prisoner serving a life sentence for murder. She escaped from her police car while being escorted out of jail for a medical examination. She ran home, hoping to see her biological father Michael one last time. Since Jeanie was imprisoned, Michael had never visited her. She desperately wanted to know why the father who had cherished her since childhood had suddenly become so heartless. However, when she reached the front door, her father resolutely refused to let her in. It turned out that shortly after Jeanie committed the crime, her mother had passed away. From then on, Michael's life had been plunged into darkness. Besides enduring the endless pain of losing his wife and child, he also had to bear the stigma of raising his daughter poorly, causing harm to others and himself. These series of family tragedies gradually transformed his love for Jeanie into hatred. In fact, he severed their fatherly relationship. Seeing that her father still harbored resentment after all these years, she immediately fell into boundless despair. Right in front of her father, she slowly backed away into the road in front of their house. She was quickly struck and killed instantly by a speeding bus. After the police received the report and arrived at the scene, based on the skid marks on the road and the testimony of Michael and other witnesses, they confirmed that Jeanie had acted rashly. This case initially seemed unremarkable. However, Inspector Vera, who was in charge of the case, while reviewing the file on Jeanie's murder 11 years earlier, inadvertently discovered a suspicious detail. This then revealed a horrifying and unexpected truth behind Jeanie's case. The victim in that year's case was Abby. Abby's father was Keith, a prominent local shipping magnate. His wife had passed away early, leaving him to raise Abby alone. The two relied on each other to survive. Before the crime, Jeanie was Keith's girlfriend. At the time, Jeanie was in her early 20s, a significant age difference. Jeanie was only a few years older than Abby. Abby strongly opposed her father's relationship with Jeanie and frequently clashed with her. One day, Abby was strangled to death in a field. Police extracted a sample of Jeanie's skin from Abby's fingernails. Jeanie also had a very clear scratch mark on her face. Jeanie repeatedly insisted she didn't kill Abby and that the facial injuries were just from an argument and struggle. The police never found the murder weapon. However, since Abby was only 15 years old and had no conflicts with anyone other than Jeanie, the case was not entirely accurate. Furthermore, Jeanie was unable to provide an alibi at the time of the crime. Therefore, the judge ultimately found Jeanie guilty of murder and sentenced her to life imprisonment. After Jeanie's death, Vera, while reviewing the old case files, discovered a clearly suspicious detail. Around the time of the crime, a couple who knew Jeanie had seen her alone on the roadside about 30 kilometers from the crime scene while in a taxi on their way to the airport. She was drinking alcohol and appeared extremely depressed. At that time, the couple had completed their immigration procedures to the US and were rushing to the airport to catch their flight, so they didn't get out of the car to question Jeanie. In other words, Jeanie was not present at the crime scene at all. Shortly after, when the witness couple read the news about Jeanie being suspected of murdering Abby, they even called the local police station to declare their willingness to provide an alibi for her. However, because the police couldn't find any other suspects, they ultimately rejected the witness couple's testimony and forwarded Jeanie's case directly to the prosecutor's office for prosecution. This resulted in her being sentenced to life imprisonment. The police station where Vera worked was called the Northumberland City Police Department. Vera joined the police force at a young age and had worked there ever since, starting as a trainee and rising to her current position as Inspector General. However, when Abby's murder occurred, Vera was still just an ordinary police officer and wasn't involved in the investigation. She was shocked to discover how negligent her former colleagues were. She immediately berated all the officers, both old and new, at the police station. Afterward, Vera decided to reopen the investigation into Abby's death to bring justice to the deceased Jeanie. The news media immediately reported extensively on Jeanie's wrongful conviction. Later, Vera and her assistant, Joe, visited the victim's father, Keith, and briefly informed him that Jeanie was not the real killer of Abby. They also summarized the police's plan to reinvestigate the case. Hearing this, Keith was not only deeply shocked, but also deeply confused. Years ago, whenever Abby and Jeanie had conflicts, Keith always sided with his girlfriend. After Abby's sudden murder and Jeanie's conviction, Keith's life, like Michael's, had fallen into boundless darkness. Although he possessed considerable wealth over the years, he remained single, spending his days drowning his sorrows in alcohol. He never imagined the police would now conclude that Jeanie was not the real killer, but she was gone. This made Keith feel guilty towards both Abby and Jeanie. Seeing Keith's depressed state, Vera offered some words of comfort before leaving. Because Joe had family matters to attend to, he left work early. Vera, meanwhile, relentlessly sought out Robert, Jeanie's supervising officer, to inquire about her situation. Washington. Prisoners in England are usually assigned a supervising officer who is responsible for long-term communication with the prisoner, observing their mental state, monitoring the prison environment, and many other tasks. Robert was a longtime friend of Vera's. According to him, Jeanie's mood during her sentence was unstable. At times, she denied committing murder and wanted to appeal. At other times, she felt guilty towards Abby. While speaking, Robert rummaged through his office and pulled out a CD, which he gave to Vera. Inside was a video of Jeanie repenting. After Vera returned to the police station, she immediately watched the CD in her office. In the video, Jeanie faced the camera and recounted the feud between herself and Abby. The two had a very deep-seated conflict. Abby adamantly refused to let her father date Jeanie. Jeanie, however, treated Abby like a child and completely disregarded her opinion. This suggests Jeanie did indeed have a motive to kill Abby. To confirm whether Jeanie was the real culprit, Vera wanted to contact the couple who had offered Jeanie an alibi 11 years prior. However, the couple had changed their phone numbers over the years, making contact impossible. She decided to leave work and go home to rest. That same evening, another murder occurred in the area. This time, the victim was Robert's son, Chris. Robert had a son and a daughter, Chris and Emma. Emma was now married to James, a man with a full beard. Emma and James had recently become parents, and their son was still an infant. Chris, who was murdered, was only 26 years old. At 15, he had suddenly left home and rarely returned. For some unknown reason, Chris suddenly returned to Northumberland during the day. He was murdered shortly after arriving. At the time of the crime, Keith was hosting a charity dinner at his mansion. Many prominent local figures were invited, including Robert, Mary, James, and Emma. In addition, Keith, feeling guilty towards Jeanie, had also invited Michael to the party. At the dinner, Mary, while pouring wine, accidentally cut her palm with a broken glass. Since giving birth to Emma and Chris over 20 years ago, Mary's mental state had deteriorated due to postpartum depression. She was often absent-minded and disorganized, which is why she cut her hand while pouring wine. Seeing herself bleeding from an injury, she went to her family car parked outside the mansion to find bandages. There, she discovered Chris slumped in the back of the car, no longer breathing. The trunk lid was open, suggesting Chris had been fatally assaulted while retrieving or putting things in the trunk. After Vera and others arrived at the scene, they confirmed Chris died from a forceful blow to the back of the head. The estimated time of death was about 20 minutes before Mary went to the car to get bandages. The forensic pathologist collected some mud from the wound on the back of Chris's head, which did not belong to the crime scene. This mud should have been on the murder weapon. However, no murder weapon was found at the scene. Because Keith normally lived a simple, solitary life, there were no surveillance cameras inside or outside his mansion. Therefore, the process of the crime being committed could not be recorded. However, before the charity party began, someone had seen Chris walking around Keith's villa. After Vera finished examining the crime scene and conducting preliminary questioning of the guests at the charity party, she was preparing to return to the police station. At that moment, she accidentally saw her colleague, Inspector Caroline, walking past the crime scene, so she went over to greet her. Caroline was Vera's former colleague. Vera's current position in office previously belonged to Caroline. Vera could reluctantly be considered Caroline's successor. Coincidentally, Caroline was the one in charge of handling the Abby murder case 11 years ago. It was she who sent the suspect Jeanie to prison. After this case closed, Caroline voluntarily resigned and left the police force. Thinking about the possibility that Jeanie was wrongly convicted and imprisoned all those years ago, Vera suddenly felt an inexplicable unease towards Caroline. So, after exchanging a few cold, polite words, she turned and left. When Vera returned to the police station, her subordinates quickly investigated Chris's travel history and call logs before his death. On the day of the crime, he had suddenly returned to his hometown after many years, but instead of going home, he made 2 phone calls beforehand. Then he arranged a private meeting with James. One of Chris's calls was to Emma, saying he wanted to stay at her house for a few days. The other call was to Inspector Vera's office. At that time, Vera was alone in her office, concentrating on watching Jeanie's repentance video, so she didn't hear the phone ring. After hearing her subordinate's report, she checked her office phone's voicemail. She discovered that there was indeed a voicemail message from Chris inside. She felt extremely suspicious about this. She had never met Chris before, and certainly hadn't given him her office phone number, so why would he call her office? In the voicemail, Chris said some very cryptic things. He said that she might not remember him anymore. He also said he wasn't there to blame her, but both she and he had Jeanie's blood on their hands. At this point, someone had to stand up and uphold justice. After hearing Chris's voicemail, Vera's suspicions deepened. The next morning, Vera ordered Joe to find James to ask why Chris had arranged to meet him before the crime. Vera then took Chris's voicemail to visit Robert again. After hearing his son's message, he also felt confused. After some thought, he led Vera to a room on the second floor of his his house. This was Chris's bedroom. Through the window of this room, one could see several tall golden cypress trees outside. According to Robert's recollection, the place where Abby was murdered years ago was in a field not far from his house. The person who discovered Abby's body was Emma, Abby's best friend. When Abby's body was found, Chris was alone in his bedroom on the second floor. Because of the golden cypress trees obscuring the view, he couldn't see the scene of Abby's murder from his bedroom. But Robert felt that Abby's death so close to his house had caused a huge psychological shock to Chris. That's why Chris ran away from home. To this day, he still believes he is responsible for Abby's death. Vera clearly disagreed with Robert's explanation, but the thoughts of a 15-year-old are sometimes very difficult for adults to understand. When Vera said goodbye to Robert and returned to the police station, Joe had also finished his interrogation of James and returned. According to James's testimony, his relationship with Chris had never been good. The reason was that while Chris was away, he frequently called Emma to demand living expenses. James found this extremely annoying. As for Chris's purpose in meeting James on the day of the crime, it was actually just to apologize. James thought Chris was only apologizing for constantly demanding Emma's living expenses, so he didn't pay much attention to it. After hearing Joe's report, a glimmer of hope suddenly appeared in Vera's mind, which had been burdened with suspicion. She felt that she had instantly figured out the truth of the case. The real murderer of Abby was not Jeanie, but Chris. The scene of Abby's murder was right near Robert's house. According to Robert's revelation, when Abby's body was discovered, Chris was alone in his bedroom on the second floor. Vera suspects that Chris secretly climbed out the window to murder Abby. He then climbed back out the window and returned to his bedroom, pretending nothing happened. After the crime, fearing exposure, he fled. Perhaps his guilt grew after years of being away, especially after seeing the news of Jeanie's wrongful conviction and death. This tormented him even more, leading him to return to his hometown to prepare to confess. This also explains why Chris arranged to meet James before the crime. Over the years, Chris had wasted a considerable amount of Emma and James's money, so he apologized before confessing. As for Chris's presence near Keith's house before the crime, it likely stemmed from a feeling of guilt. However, Vera still has 3 issues she hasn't thought through. First, what was Chris's motive for murdering Abby? Second, if Chris was the real murderer, then who was the real killer? Third, what was the meaning of the voicemail message Chris left on Vera's office phone before his murder? The third question was quickly answered. While searching near the scene of Chris's murder, the police found his backpack. Inside was a book. Clipped between the pages was a photo of Abby from 11 years ago. Along with it was an old business card belonging to Caroline, the person who handled Abby's murder case all those years ago. Vera finally understood that the voicemail message Chris sent to her office was actually a message for Caroline. Chris had been away for many years, so he didn't know Caroline had left her job long ago. Therefore, he left the message for Caroline. The content of these 2 text messages also reinforced Vera's earlier conclusion that Chris was the real murderer of Abby. He knew that what Caroline did years ago was wrong. That's why, before confessing, he called her and criticized her, saying that she, like him, had Jeanie's blood on her hands. Thinking of this, Vera decided to go find Caroline to talk to her directly. When a veteran police officer at the station heard that Vera was about to meet Caroline, he revealed shocking information to her. Apparently, during the investigation of Abby's murder, Caroline had a shady relationship with Keith. Perhaps that's why she used her position to take revenge. Caroline considered Jeanie the murderer and sent her to prison. Vera was furious upon hearing this. Perhaps that's why the police prosecuted Jeanie years ago, even though no murder weapon was found. It turned out Caroline had used her position to attack her rival. Later, Vera arranged to meet Caroline at a cafe and frankly criticized her for abusing her power and breaking the law, which had led to Jeanie's wrongful conviction. At the same time, Vera also stated her entire reasoning about Chris being the real killer. Caroline was so angered by Vera's bluntness that she was speechless. After calming down, she explained to Vera that she had indeed had a relationship with Keith, but this happened after Jeanie went to prison, not while she was investigating the case. Despite this, Caroline resigned and left the police force. She felt that, regardless of the circumstances, having a relationship with the victim's father violated the principles of a police officer. After saying this, she turned and left. After Vera returned to the police station, she and Joe pieced together the details of the case again. If Vera's earlier reasoning was that Chris was the real killer of Abby, then at least 2 people would surely hate him to the core. One was Keith and the other was Michael. Chris died near Keith's mansion. At that time, Keith was hosting a charity party at his house, and Michael had also been invited to attend. This suggests that both men had a motive for murder. It's possible they quietly left the party scene when no one was paying attention to murder Chris. Although Vera couldn't understand how Michael and Keith knew Chris was a potential killer, she decided to summon Michael to the police station for questioning. questioning based on this speculation. After learning he was a police suspect, Michael angrily berated Vera. In his eyes, it was the police's negligence that led to his daughter being wrongly accused of murder, causing tragedy for his family. Now, the police dared to suspect him of Chris's murder, and he couldn't tolerate it any longer. After scolding Vera, Michael stood up and left the police station. Vera didn't dare stop him. She calmed down a bit and decided to call the second suspect, Keith, who might be Chris's murderer, to the police station for questioning. But she received news that Keith had just been attacked and injured at home. He had been rushed to the hospital. When Vera arrived at the hospital, Keith denied any involvement in Chris's murder. He then recounted the attack to Vera. He recalled that while drinking at home, someone hit him on the back of the head with a bottle, knocking him unconscious. Therefore, he couldn't clearly see the attacker's face, nor did he know if it was male or female. After hearing this, Vera left feeling dejected. From Michael and Keith's demeanor when confronted by the police, they didn't seem like Chris's murderers. Furthermore, they didn't seem to have any idea that Chris might be the real killer. The problem was, besides Michael and Keith having a motive to kill Chris, he had been away for many years and seemed to have no other enemies in his hometown. Could it be that Chris had wrongly accused Jeanie because he criticized Caroline, causing her to kill him in a fit of anger? This speculation is clearly illogical. Chris's phone call criticizing Caroline was made to Vera's office. In other words, before Chris was murdered, Caroline was completely unaware that he had criticized her and that she had Jeanie's blood on her hands. Therefore, she had no motive to kill Chris. Just as Vera's mind was in turmoil, Caroline proactively sought her out and delivered shocking news. According to Vera's earlier reasoning, on the day Abby was murdered, Chris was alone in his second-floor bedroom and should have climbed out the window to kill Abby. Then, he should have climbed back out the window and pretended nothing happened. However, Caroline learned from Robert and Mary that Chris had been terrified of his father since childhood, to the point that Chris was extremely worried that his father would fly through the window into the house. Therefore, from a very young age, Chris had asked his father to use iron bars to seal the only window in his bedroom. In other words, Chris's bedroom window was impossible to open from beginning to end. Therefore, Vera realized that the conclusion that Chris climbed out the window to commit murder was completely unfounded. After hearing Caroline's analysis, Vera was utterly bewildered. The overwhelming feeling of failure even made her doubt her own abilities at times. If Chris wasn't the murderer of Abby, then who was it? Afterward, Vera went alone to the field where Abby was murdered years ago. She wanted to breathe some fresh air and clear her mind of the chaotic thoughts. She stood in the middle of the field, looking towards Robert's house. It wasn't far from Robert's house. If it weren't for the tall golden cypress trees in front of Robert's house obstructing her view, she could almost see the entire field through the second-floor window. After walking around the field twice, Vera went to Robert's house and found Mary working alone inside. Vera was chatting with Mary when she mentioned the cypress trees outside the door. According to Mary, these cypress trees were planted 10 years ago. Abby was murdered 11 years ago, and the cypress trees in front of Robert's house were also planted 10 years ago. This means that at the time Abby was murdered in the field, there were no cypress trees obstructing the view in front of Robert's house. Therefore, Chris, who was on the second floor of his house, most likely saw the entire murder through the window. Chris wasn't the killer. He was an eyewitness to Abby's murder. But why didn't he report it to the police immediately? Instead, he left home after the crime. There's only one answer. The killer is a close relative or friend of Chris's. Chris didn't want to report that person to the police, so he chose to hide. Thinking this, Vera hurried back to the police station and prepared to piece together the case again with her colleagues. At that moment, the police searching the scene where Chris was murdered found a shovel on a nearby riverbank. The mud remaining on the shovel perfectly matched the mud on the wound on the back of Chris's neck. This shovel was the murder weapon used to kill Chris. Furthermore, the shovel bore the name of a canoe club. Coincidentally, James was working as a navigator at this very canoe club. Clearly, James was a prime suspect in the crime. Meanwhile, after Keith returned home from the hospital following the attack, he suddenly remembered a detail. The night Chris was murdered was also the night Keith was hosting a charity party at his house, and James had seen an old photograph hanging there. James was shocked, as if struck by a great blow. This old photograph was taken by Keith with veteran employees when he first started working in the shipping industry. At first, Keith didn't understand why James was so surprised by this photo. Only now did he figure it out. The photo showed a man named Henry. Henry had previously worked under Keith. In Keith's memory, James and Henry looked remarkably alike. 11 years ago, at a staff party Keith hosted, Henry got drunk and fatally stabbed 3 innocent passersby. After sobering up, he couldn't bear the guilt of his actions and did something reckless. Now that Keith thought about it, James must be Henry's son. Furthermore, Keith suspected that James was the attacker. James's break-in at Keith's house might have been for the old photograph. laughs. Keith immediately shared this speculation with Vera. Vera then ordered her subordinates to retrieve James's personal file. The investigation revealed that James had changed his name 11 years prior. It seemed he wanted to conceal his true identity. It appeared highly likely that James was the murderer of Abby years ago. James's motive for killing Abby was probably revenge against her father, Keith. After all, Keith had organized the staff party that led to Henry's drunken car accident. After committing the murder, James changed his name to evade responsibility. His murder of Chris was to silence him, as Chris had witnessed James's crime 11 years earlier. However, there was one thing Vera couldn't understand. Why did Chris let him go instead of exposing James's crime? When Abby was murdered, James hadn't yet married Chris's sister. Could Chris and James have known each other for a long time and had an unusual relationship? Vera decided that no matter what, she had to apprehend James and bring him to the police station. However, when Vera arrived at James's residence, she discovered that he, Emma, and their child had all disappeared. Feeling dire, Vera frantically searched everywhere, but to no avail. Desperate, she went to Robert's house again to ask if he and Mary knew anything about James's family. They also knew nothing. Just as Vera was becoming anxious, James called Robert and Mary to reassure them he was safe. He also mentioned that he would be moving elsewhere with his wife and child. Vera, standing nearby, overheard James's phone call about a ship. She immediately instructed Joe to lead his men to the only local ferry terminal to intercept James. She remained at Robert's house, waiting for news and continuing to question them about James's situation. Joe rushed to the ferry terminal and found James and his family on a ship about to set sail. Seeing his true identity revealed, James was forced to confess everything. It turned out that James was indeed Henry's son. Since Henry's death, James had endured discrimination and ostracism from those around him. To start over and change his life, he was forced to change his name. Later, he married Robert's daughter, Emma. Finally, he found a peaceful and stable life. The only thing that bothered James was Emma's worthless younger brother, Chris. He was always calling home, demanding money from his sister. James was extremely dissatisfied with this, but he never stopped his wife from sending money to her brother. On the day Chris was murdered, James, his wife, and his wife's parents were all attending a dinner party at Keith's mansion. During the party, James accidentally saw a photo of his father taken at Keith's house. From that moment, he recalled a painful past that had long been buried in dust. Since then, he had been constantly worried that his past identity would be revealed and that he would lose his current peaceful life. After much agonizing, he finally decided to prepare to move his wife and children away from this place to live elsewhere. What surprised Joe was James's adamant denial of ever killing anyone. The deaths of Abby and Chris had absolutely nothing to do with him. James had also never broken into Keith's mansion to attack him. However, before Chris was murdered, he did ask James to borrow a shovel. He said he wanted to dig up an important item from the ground. While Joe was conducting preliminary questioning of James at the dock, Vera, who was waiting for news at Robert's house, had finished her conversation and began wandering around Robert's house boredly. When she went around to Robert's study, she accidentally saw several DVDs on his desk. The labels on the discs all bore Jeannie's name. Robert was Jeannie's supervisor, so the videos on the discs were likely recorded by him during his visits to her cell. While Robert and Mary weren't around, Vera went into his office and, out of curiosity, turned on the CD player to test both discs. Vera discovered that the content consisted entirely of videos of Jeanie recounting her conflict with Abby, as well as denying her murder of Abby. Robert had previously provided Vera with a similar disc, but its content was entirely Jeannie's account of her conflict with Abby, completely lacking any part of her denying the murder. Vera suddenly realized that the CD evidence Robert had given her was a manipulated video. Robert had tricked Jeanie into recording a confession in prison, then used editing techniques to distort it into a video of her repentance. Looking at the manipulated video, Jeanie did indeed look like the real murderer of Abby. The question is, why would Robert edit and manipulate this video of Jeanie? At that moment, Robert pushed the door open and walked in. Seeing that Vera had discovered the secret, Robert had no choice but to confess his crime. The murderer of Abby was not Jeanie, nor Chris as Vera had suspected, but Robert himself. Emma and Abby were close friends. When the crime occurred, they were both still in high school. Robert had met Abby while driving Emma to and from school. Unexpectedly, Abby had actively seduced Robert, who was 40 years older than her. At first, he thought she was just teasing him, but under her repeated provocations, he eventually couldn't resist and had a relationship with her. They had a secret affair several times. Just as Robert was feeling anxious about this affair, Abby suddenly came to his house and declared that she would tell her father Keith about their relationship. It turned out that Abby's sole purpose in actively seducing Robert was to provoke and take revenge on her own father. Because her father ignored her advice and insisted on marrying Jeanie, after realizing he was being used as a tool by Abby, he first knelt and begged her not to expose their shameful affair. However, she paid no heed. She was determined to use their relationship to provoke her father. Enraged, Robert used a rope to strangle Abby to death in a field not far from his house. What he never expected was that Chris had witnessed the entire crime through the window. Chris, then only 15 years old, didn't want to report his father and didn't want to stay in the house, so he chose to leave. Only when he saw the news that Jeanie had been falsely accused and driven to such a desperate act did he feel immense guilt. He decided to return to his hometown to denounce his own father. Therefore, after returning to his hometown, he didn't go home or contact his parents, but only called his sister and arranged to meet James to apologize. Perhaps in Chris's eyes, his family would soon face tragedy, and he and Emma would both become the children of a murderer. He could hope James would understand their situation. When Robert learned of Chris's return from Emma, he immediately understood the reason for his son's return. To avoid his crime being exposed and to escape imprisonment, he left the charity party to personally kill his own son. After hearing Robert's confession, Vera felt disgusted. At that moment, Keith called Vera to report that he had found a mud-covered bundle inside his mansion. Vera quickly ordered someone to retrieve the bundle. Then, right in front of Robert and Mary, Vera opened the bundle. Inside the bag was a crumpled, tattered women's scarf. Upon seeing this scarf, Mary, who was usually in a state of panic, suddenly recalled a long-suppressed memory. From Mary's vague account, Vera realized that the real murderer of Abby was not Robert, but Mary. Robert's earlier claim that he used a piece of rope he picked up to strangle Abby was clearly a lie. The murder weapon should have been this scarf. Before the crime, this scarf had been Mary's personal belongings. When Abby went to Robert's house to talk to him, Mary overheard their entire conversation. Robert was so frightened and flustered that he could only watch Abby turn and leave. Mary then followed Abby and used the very scarf she was wearing to chain Abby to death in a field not far from the house. After committing the murder, Mary, already in a state of mental instability, fainted on the spot. Chris witnessed the entire scene of his mother committing the crime. In a panic, he ran out of the house to the crime scene and brought his mother back home. He also buried the murder weapon, the handkerchief, in a place where it would be difficult to find. Afterward, he chose to leave home. Afterward, his mother completely forgot about the murder. 11 years later, Chris could no longer bear the torment in his heart, so he returned to his hometown to expose his mother's crime. When Robert learned of the crime, he killed his own son. Fortunately, Chris had secretly placed the handkerchief in Keith's mansion beforehand. He hoped that Keith would discover the handkerchief and hand it over to the police to find the real murderer of Abby. The person who broke into Keith's mansion and attacked him was also Robert. Robert must have suspected that Chris had hidden crucial evidence of Mary's murder in Keith's house. Therefore, he wanted to steal it, but he couldn't. After putting away the towel, Chris went outside Keith's mansion to find the car his family had driven there. He pried open the trunk to return the shovel he had borrowed from James. As a result, he was attacked by his own father. Then Vera revealed her suspicions. After Mary learned that her husband had killed their son, she immediately screamed and went into a state of madness. The secret was finally revealed. The film ends here. See you in the next videos.